Hello everyone, this will be my final video for today, and then tomorrow I will be doing my random video, and that will be the last video for a while where I'll be taking a break because school will be starting again, and then I'll be returning eventually in around August time, but I will leave that open to discussion in my random video. But in this particular video, I wanted to discuss Shutter Island. I got done watching Shutter Island a few days ago, or I think it was like a week ago or so, but it's fairly fresh in my mind, and I still have a full grasp and understanding of the film, I think, for the most part. But it's a rather interesting film in that Leonardo DiCaprio is not really, I think he is recognized in particular maybe for this film, but I don't think as much as, say, something like Titanic or something maybe on the lines of like The Departed. It seems like this is more one of his works that's a little bit more under the bus. I think that's fairly understandable because, again, I think this film is, it's not that I didn't come away disliking it. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, and I think the way that the director, Martin Scorsese, uses this sort of psychological thriller genre, I think really works to the film's advantage. But despite that, I think a lot of people will be sort of disappointed with the ending, which I think can be understandable without giving anything away. It sort of doesn't end like on a fully concluding, I guess, note, you could say, at least from the way I viewed it. So that may divide some people onto whether or not they like or dislike the film. But as a whole, I still found it to be fairly enjoyable and fairly engaging for the most part. Does it lag at times? Well, yeah. I think at times they could have maybe cut some stuff out that wasn't really ultimately necessary. But I think overall Martin Scorsese, I think, does a good job of making it feel like a psychological thriller. And the interesting thing too is you kind of don't really know where it's going to go, which I think is very difficult for a lot of films to do. And I found it interesting how you really don't know how it's going to turn out and what all of it really means. So I think when a film can do that, it's really doing something fairly interesting and I think fairly effective if it can keep you guessing, if it can keep you speculating about certain things. But basically what you have to understand about Shutter Island is that it starts off with our main protagonist, Leonardo DiCaprio, who's playing Edward Teddy Daniels, a U.S. Marshal. And basically what ends up happening is that one of the inmates on this island, called Shutter Island basically, it has gone missing, and it's up to him, as well as Mark Ruffalo's character, named Chuck Owl, to figure out where that person is and figure out what happened to them ultimately. And so they basically go through this whole interview process. They go through the whole asylum, but basically the whole island is an insane asylum. It's for crazy people, for violent offenders, people that you wouldn't really want to be around so much. And it kind of makes sense, though, that they would put them on an island somewhere secluded from the rest of society. And they basically come across Ben Kingsley's character named Dr. John Cawley, and basically he sort of introduces them to the whole the whole facilities that they have, and tries to sort of give them a sense of where they can sort of start with their case. And what you have to understand is that there's a lot of flashbacks in this movie. In particular with Leo's character, because he is probably the most interesting out of the bunch, because he has a very sort of fairly tragic backstory. I mean, his backstory is just... I couldn't believe that backstory. That was just brutal. But basically what you have to understand about the backstory is that he originally served in World War II. So again, he went through the whole trauma of seeing the concentration camps and, you know, seeing the brutality and seeing people basically killing each other. And you watch this one scene in where even Leo's character is probably not the most perfect of heroes, in that he kind of has this strong sort of anger and resentment towards people, and in particular the Nazis, which is fairly understandable. But at the same time, he kind of lacks that kind of sympathy towards certain situations, which I think is fairly understandable. In particular, when you see the one scene of where he's literally walking into this room, and there's just papers flying everywhere, and Martin Scorsese makes this look so stylish. There's, even though this film it does have its nit and gritty aspects to it, but it has this kind of style and this movement of all these papers flying everywhere, and then Leonardo DiCaprio's character is walking through the room, and then you see a Nazi guy on the floor, and I think it's hinted at that he actually wanted to kill himself, but he couldn't get around to actually killing himself. He just basically is completely injured on the floor and just kind of bleeding out. And instead of Leo letting him sort of shoot himself, or Leo shooting him, he just decides that he should suffer, and he pushes the gun away so that he can't reach for it and kill himself. And I think that kind of shows that Leonardo DiCaprio's character is fairly dynamic in that way, and that he's not this kind of perfect hero who would just shoot the guy immediately, and instead would rather have him suffer for his crimes, which I think is more human to me, and makes his character a little bit more human in that respects, even though you could argue whether or not that was the morally correct thing to do. So you do see those kinds of flashbacks happen, and you do see kind of the brutality and the gruesomeness that Leonardo DiCaprio's character kind of goes through, and that's one aspect, though, of his past. There's also another aspect, and this is where another character comes in, named Dolores Chanel, and she's played by Michelle Williams, and her character is ultimately crazy, and she actually ends up doing something fairly gruesome, and I don't really want to give it away, but she ends up playing ultimately Leonardo DiCaprio's wife, and she just goes a little crazy one day, and you'll see how he constantly has her in his mind. And it's fairly sad, because you do feel like he still has some love for her, but she's just so crazy, and what she does is just so insane that it completely is messes up his character, and it makes him feel completely lost and depressed, essentially, and hurt and confused. And this is really presented throughout the entire thing. You do get that sense of that this character has a lot of issues and pains, and you do feel those things coming and presented through Leo's acting, as well as through these sort of backstories and circumstances. And I think it cuts back appropriately, but if you're not that kind of person who likes flashbacks, this may be a bother for you. I'm not sure. It all depends kind of on how you choose to view the film, but ultimately there are flashbacks. There are a lot of flashbacks, and it kind of goes into his whole story of how everything that he's had is basically leading up to this point in time where he's trying to solve this case. And really that's all you need to know, really, going in plot-wise, because I do not want to give this away. I think the twists and turns that this plot takes are just very good and very smart, and I think Martin Scorsese just did a good job with it. I mean, does it have flaws? And with the ending, yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those, it's kind of a cliffhanger ending. I mean, I'm sure people could get around and understand what the ending kind of means, but it's not really clear, ultimately, what ends up happening, what ends up really resulting with everything that the story has built up to. And I think that's kind of what got me sucked out of the film and in enjoying it, because it just leaves you on this note where you go, wait, what's gonna happen now? Wait, what? How can that? You really want to know ultimately what ends up really happening, but you don't really get a sense of that because the film doesn't show you ultimately. It just kind of ends, and I think that ending is really the only, I think, major issue people could probably see with this film. Now, is it an intelligent film? Absolutely. I think it is intelligent to its audience. I think it is trying to get somewhere, and I think it is trying to address issues, and it's interesting to have it take place within sort of a mental hospital, and with these characters, especially Leonardo DiCaprio, who has like issues of his own, and his whole backstories kind of explore that. So you really do get a sense ultimately of his character. The other characters, although they're there and they do feel like characters, and you do feel like Leo has some genuine moments with his partner Chuck. I believe that's his name, Chuck. I could be wrong. I think is it Chuck? I want to swear it is. I am just so bad with names today. What is my problem with names? But yes, Chuck Owl, who's played by Mark Ruffalo. His character, you do get a sense of their kind of relationship, but it ultimately takes a drastic change once these plot elements are revealed. So really, this is a plot-driven movie. It's plot-driven as well as Leonardo DiCaprio's character-driven, meaning that he's really the main focus, but there's still these characters as well that have, unique aspects to them, but ultimately Leo is really the main focus here. You're not really going to get so much in depth with the other characters. Only expect the in-depthness that you get with Leo as to be the ultimate source of character development throughout the entire film. But at the same time, I don't think that's bad. I think ultimately it still brings out a lot of other things, because it's really about Leo and what basically just surrounds him and what he thinks he's surrounded by. And ultimately you discover a lot about him and his struggles, and you kind of see how each character sort of fits in with those struggles. But it's not a character study of these other characters, because again, the film, I think, tries to take it on the idea that we're looking at this more through Leo's perspective rather than another character, really. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say ultimately about this film. It is a little twisted. Maybe you'll like the twists, maybe you won't. And again, it's kind of like, that's what you have to consider going into the film, is kind of, oh, do I really want to see what risks end up resulting and what it all means? And I personally find it enjoyable. I don't regret seeing it. Does the ending kind of bother me? Yes, it does bother me because I go, oh, why? Can't you just tell me really what happens? I want to know what happens. But I think it's still interesting that the film decides to leave it open like that. It's just a matter of whether or not you can appreciate it. It's sort of like I want to say it's almost it's almost an Old Country for Old Men like ending. Not that it's dull. I thought the ending in Country for Old Men was kind of a dull ending, but this ending, it leads up to this, and you're like, really, what's gonna happen now? Like, what? How is this gonna? And then it ends, and then you go, okay, where's this? What's gonna end up happening? You don't know. But I think it's one of those films that's sort of intended to leave you that way. It's intended to leave you guessing and assuming and making conclusions and thinking for yourself about things, because it is really about drawing your own conclusions, and you really do kind of see the sort of aspects of reality, what is really real and what's really, really fake, and it's interesting to look at them and look at them really closely, because it really allows you to get a grasp of who Leo's character is and the kinds of things that he's gone through. And I think a lot of what is presented is fairly interesting, fairly real. Is it a little bit stylized in the way that it's presented? Yeah, that could be said. But I think despite that, it does feel like it does feel like you're going through the mind, and you're looking at the sort of the psychology of the person, and you're looking at what ultimately ends up happening, and where the characters go, and what the characters become, and what really ends up happening ultimately with Teddy, and how everything that surrounds Teddy ultimately gets revealed in sort of a different light as it's exploring through the entire story to you. Is it always a on the edge of your seat constantly thriller? I wouldn't say so. But it does keep you engaged. It does keep you interested. Could there have been some scenes maybe cut out? Yeah, I'm sure there could have been. Could have it moved a little bit faster? Yeah, I could have done that. But I think despite those kinds of flaws, it still, I think, holds up as a decent film overall. A decent Scorsese film that looks into the mind and looks into Leo's character, Teddy, and looks into the whole psychology of the sort of murder mystery, and how ultimately Teddy discovers something within himself that changes his whole perspective on everything that has surrounded him. Basically he changes his whole perspective of what everything that is surrounding him is ultimately, and he kind of discovers a little bit more about himself. And I think that's really interesting. It's an interesting look into the mind. It's an interesting look into character, and it's an interesting look into plot twists and turns. And ultimately, it kind of makes sense. Could some people maybe see it coming? I'm sure that they could. I'm sure you could say that certain aspects maybe of this film could be predictable. But I didn't really guess that. Because it kind of, Scorsese, I think, tries to confuse you and tease with you the whole plot, which, again, I think some people could say is not as productive, but I think still teasing it and working it with it the way that it was presented, I think works to the film's advantage as a whole. But can people say it's maybe predictable? Well, maybe you could. You could draw that conclusion. But I think it's only when you see it the first time that it's the most exciting. So again, it's really one of those films you can't really repeat watching unless you've skipped parts over it, because you do have to watch the whole film in order to get it completely. But it's I still think an interesting film, and I think it was definitely an interesting film to end on, because you do feel sort of the tragedy within Leo's character, and I think the acting is well done. I think the script is good for what it is, and it does feel like a genuine thriller type-esque movie. And is it super genius Oscar-worthy work? I wouldn't say so, but at the same time, I think it still is an interesting take on sort of the psychology of people and how perception of reality and can be difficult for a lot of people to cope with, especially if they've been through traumatic circumstances within their lives. But I think that's ultimately all that I can say as a whole about this film. Any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them, and hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow, where I'll be doing my last video for a while, and I'll kind of go in and explain what I ultimately wish to hold in store for hopefully August. But until then, everybody,